My son stood in his doorway on Christmas Eve and said, "Mom, you weren't invited. This dinner is for real family only. Please leave." I smiled, said nothing, and drove home. That night, I called my attorney. 3 days later, my son discovered what I had done, and everything fell apart for him. Good evening, dear friends. I'm Margaret, and I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Please like this video and stay until the very end. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. I spent 41 years as a high school English teacher in Columbus, Ohio. I taught other people's children how to find meaning in words, how to read between the lines, how to recognize a story's turning point. The great irony of my life is that I completely missed the turning point in my own. My husband, Donald, passed away 3 years ago from a heart attack. Sudden, no warning. Here one morning, and gone by afternoon. We had built everything together, Donald and I. The house on Elmwood Drive, the savings accounts, the retirement fund. We had been careful with money our entire lives because we wanted to leave something meaningful behind. For our son, Nathan, and for our grandchildren. After Donald died, Nathan became my reason to get up in the morning. He lived 40 minutes away in Westerville with his wife, Diane, and their 2 children, Caleb, who was 7, and Sophie, who was 5. I drove out there every other Sunday. I brought homemade lasagna and brownies. I helped Sophie with her reading. I played catch with Caleb in the backyard until my shoulder ached. Those afternoons kept me alive during the worst grief of my life. I also helped them financially, because that is what mothers do when they are able. When Nathan and Diane bought their house 4 years ago, I gave them $40,000 toward the down payment. When Diane's car needed replacing, I wrote a check for $18,000 without hesitation. When they enrolled Caleb in a private school with a better learning environment for his dyslexia, I covered the tuition, $9,000 a year. Small contributions here and there added up as well. Over 3 years, I had given my son and his family somewhere close to $85,000. I never once considered it a loan. I considered it love made practical. But love should not require a receipt. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being Nathan's mother and started being Nathan's safety net. The signs appeared gradually, the way a slow leak does damage long before anyone notices the water. Nathan's calls went from 3 times a week to once, then to texts only, when I suggested Sunday dinners. Diane always had a reason why that particular weekend was difficult. The children's activities, a commitment with her own parents, work stress, home repairs that were never quite finished. I told myself I understood. Young families are stretched thin. I remembered those years with Donald, the exhaustion, the calendar that was never empty, but a hollow feeling settled in my chest that I could not explain away. 6 weeks before Christmas, I asked Nathan whether I should plan on joining them for the holiday. His response came the following day. A single line, "We'll have to see how things shape up." That was it. No warmth. No, of course you're coming. No, we wouldn't have it any other way. Just a non-answer delivered like a memo from someone who had already made a decision and was waiting to announce it. I baked for 2 days preparing for Christmas Eve. A honey-glazed ham, sweet potato casserole, my mother's rum cake that Nathan had requested every December since he was 6 years old. I wrapped gifts for the children, a telescope for Caleb, who had recently become fascinated with stars, a beautiful, illustrated set of fairy tales for Sophie. I bought a bottle of the single malt scotch Donald had always kept in the cabinet, the kind Nathan had admired for years. My hands shook a little while I wrapped everything. I told myself it was the cold. Nathan finally confirmed 2 days before Christmas. Come at 5, the address, followed by nothing else. I arrived at 4:58. The driveway was packed with vehicles I did not recognize. Through the front window, I could see candlelight, movement, a full table, a room full of people laughing. My heart lifted. A real celebration. I grabbed the casserole dish, still warm from my car, looped the gift bags over my wrist, and walked to the front door. I knocked. I waited. I knocked again. The door opened, and my son stood in the frame. Behind him, I could see Diane's parents seated at the table. Her sister, her brother-in-law, their children, neighbors I had met once at a backyard barbecue 2 summers ago. Everyone was there. Everyone except, apparently, me. Nathan looked at me the way you look at someone who has shown up to the wrong address. His expression was not angry. It was something worse. It was inconvenienced. Mom. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made what followed more difficult to absorb. What are you doing here? I held up the casserole dish. It's Christmas Eve, sweetheart. You said 5 o'clock. He stepped slightly forward, lowering his voice as though he were handling a confused elderly woman who had wandered off from a care facility. Mom, this dinner is for real family. I thought I made that clear. I'm sorry, but you weren't really invited to this one. You should head home. I stood completely still. The casserole dish was warm against my palms. The bag with the telescope cut into my wrist. From somewhere inside the house, I heard Sophie's laughter, high and clear, and the sound of it broke something open in me. I looked past Nathan's shoulder. Diane was standing near the kitchen doorway. She did not look away. She looked at me steadily, without apology, and then she turned back to her guests. I understood in that moment that this had been planned. My son stepping outside and pulling it nearly closed behind him so that no one would have to witness the removal. This was choreographed. I was meant to go quietly, and wonder, so I did. I set the casserole dish on their front step. I set the gift bags beside it. I said nothing. I walked back to my car, reversed out of the driveway, and drove 40 minutes home to an empty house on Elmwood Drive where Donald's chair still sat in the living room and the only sound was the furnace. I did not cry until I was inside, with the door locked behind me. I sat at the kitchen table where Donald and I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts together, and I allowed myself 20 minutes to fall apart. Then I picked up the phone and called Richard Holt, who had been our estate attorney for 15 years. I know it's after hours, I said when he answered. I know this can wait, but I need to make changes to our will, and I'd like to schedule the earliest available appointment. Richard knew me well enough to understand the tone. He said, first thing, Thursday morning. I spent that night going through documents. Donald and I had updated our will 2 years after he was diagnosed, wanting everything to be settled and clear. The estate was substantial. The house on Elmwood, appraised at $380,000. Donald's pension and retirement accounts. My own teacher's pension, and the IRAs we had built over 4 decades of careful saving, a life insurance policy Donald had maintained since Nathan was born. Combined, the estate totaled slightly over $900,000. Nathan was the sole named beneficiary of everything. I had left him an extraordinary inheritance because I had believed, without question, that he was an extraordinary son. That belief died on Christmas Eve, on a front step in Westerville, next to a casserole dish and a telescope. I pulled out my bank statements and did what I had been too trusting to do before. I looked at the pattern. Every single time I had transferred money to Nathan or Diane, there had been a surge of warmth, calls that came more frequently, invitations to Sunday dinners that materialized suddenly and cheerfully. Mom, you're the best. Mom, I don't know what we'd do. Mom, we love you so much. And then, within weeks of the deposit clearing, the silence returned. The texts went unanswered for days. The Sunday dinners evaporated. I had been maintaining a relationship with deposits. I thought about Diane watching me from the kitchen doorway. I thought about Nathan's practiced gentleness, the lowered voice, the nearly closed door. I wondered how long they had talked about this, how many dinners they had eaten while discussing how to manage the elderly mother and her emotions. How many times Diane had said to Nathan that his mother was too much, too present, too needy. How many times Nathan had agreed because agreeing was easier than choosing. I went to bed at 2 a.m. and did not sleep. Richard Holt's office on Thursday smelled like strong coffee and old books. He had handled Donald's funeral arrangements and walked me through every step of widowhood with patience and genuine kindness. When I came in and told him what I needed, he set down his pen and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm very sorry, Margaret. You deserve far better than that. I want Nathan removed from everything," I said. The estate goes to charity, children's literacy programs, the Columbus Public Library Foundation, the hospital where Donald was treated. A specific amount to be held in trust for Caleb and Sophie, administered by a third party with clear educational restrictions, not accessible to Nathan or Diane under any circumstances. Richard was quiet for a moment. That last piece, the trust for the grandchildren. You're sure? I thought about Sophie's laughter through the door. I thought about Caleb's dyslexia and the school I had been paying to give him a fair chance. Those children had done nothing wrong. They were being raised by people who thought family was a financial transaction, and that was not their fault. Yes, I said. The grandchildren receive education funds through an independent trustee. Nathan and Diane cannot touch it, cannot redirect it, cannot claim it for any other purpose. It goes directly to the children's schooling and nothing else. Richard drafted the documents that morning. I signed in his office with 2 witnesses. When I left, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. $900,000. 41 years of work, gone from Nathan's future in 90 minutes of paperwork. I drove home and planted bulbs in the backyard, because the ground wasn't frozen yet and because I needed to do something with my hands. The call came 4 days after Christmas. I was reading by the window when Nathan's name appeared on my phone. I let it ring twice, then answered, "Mom." His voice had that careful, managed quality that I now recognized as deliberate. I wanted to call and check in. "How was your Christmas?" "Quiet," I said. "Yeah." He paused. "Listen, I wanted to talk about that night. I know it might have seemed abrupt, but we had a lot going on with Diane's family and space was limited and—" "I'm sure," I said. "Right. Well," he cleared his throat. "I also wanted to mention something. Diane and I have been looking at refinancing the house, and there's actually an opportunity to pull some equity, but the numbers are a little tight, and we were wondering if you might be able to help bridge a short gap, just temporarily. Around $25,000, and we'd absolutely pay you back. 5 days." He had waited 5 days. "No," I said. Silence. "Mom, did you hear me? This is actually time-sensitive. The rate window closes." "No, Nathan. I won't be helping with that." His voice changed. The management dissolved. "What does that mean?" "You've always helped us before." "I've helped you with many things," I said. "But I think we need to talk honestly about what's been happening between us, and I don't think a phone call is the right place for that conversation." "What is there to talk about?" he said. "You're upset about Christmas. I get it. But honestly, Mom, we needed one evening with Diane's side of the family without the extra dynamic. Is that so terrible? You're making this into something bigger than it is. The extra dynamic," he had said. I was an extra dynamic. I told him I had to go. He called back twice. I did not answer. He showed up the following Saturday with Diane. I watched from the window as they rang the bell, knocked, rang again. Diane kept her arms crossed and her expression flat. Nathan cupped his hand against the glass and looked inside. I stood still in the hallway and did not move. They left a note. "Mom, we need to talk. You're being dramatic. Call Nathan." I photographed it before throwing it away. I had already contacted Patricia Nguyen, a financial specialist recommended by Richard, who worked specifically with retired adults on estate protection. When I walked her through everything, she nodded steadily and took detailed notes. "This is not uncommon," she said. "I hear versions of this story more than you would think. The good news is your financial position is very secure. The contributions you made to Nathan's family, while generous, did not compromise your long-term stability. But I want to build a structure around your accounts that makes any future claim of undue influence very difficult to make. I hadn't even considered that they might claim I was incompetent." Patricia had. She moved my investment accounts to different institutions, established new accounts Nathan was unaware of, and created a documented paper trail showing every decision I had made with full professional guidance. "If they ever try to argue that someone manipulated you into changing your will," she said, "they will be arguing against your attorney, your financial advisor, and your own documented reasoning. That is a very difficult case to make." The confrontation came in January. I never learned exactly how Nathan found out about the will. Perhaps Richard's office mentioned something. Perhaps Nathan had simply noticed that I had stopped responding and put the pieces together. But on a gray Tuesday afternoon, my doorbell rang with the particular insistence of someone who had been rehearsing what they were going to say. I opened the door. Nathan's face was a color I had not seen since he was a teenager and had dented Donald's car. Diane stood slightly behind him with her jaw set. "Tell me this isn't true," Nathan said. "I imagine it is," I said. He pushed forward. I didn't step back, but I didn't invite them in either. We stood in the doorway. "Dad's money, Mom." "That was Dad's money too. You can't just give it away to strangers." "It was our money," I said. "I'm using it as I see fit." Diane spoke for the first time. "This is unhinged. You're punishing Nathan for one family dinner because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention for one single night." I turned to look at her. She held my gaze. "Is that how you see it?" I said. Nathan tried again. "Mom, we can fix this. We can have a real conversation. I'll admit, Christmas Eve wasn't handled well. I know that. But you don't throw away your entire family over a miscommunication." "You called me an extra dynamic," I said. "I wasn't invited to my own son's Christmas. I stood on your front step with my husband's rum cake recipe that I spent 2 days making, and you told me to go home. So we make one mistake and you disinherit our children?" Diane's voice rose. "You're cutting off Sophie and Caleb because of this? The children have been provided for," I said. "There is a trust. They will have every educational opportunity they need, but it will be administered by someone I trust, not by the two of you." Diane said something that I will not repeat. Nathan put his hand on her arm. "Mom," he said, and now his voice had changed again, lower, almost plaintive. "You're going to regret this. When you need someone and there's no one there, you're going to realize what you threw away." "I know what I have," I said. "And I know what you offered me, which was access on your terms as long as I kept my checkbook available. I'm not willing to live on those terms anymore." Nathan's face hardened. "We'll contest it. We'll say you were coerced. Richard had you sign things without full understanding. Richard has a 45-year legal career and more integrity than that accusation deserves," I said. "And I have documentation of every financial decision I have made with full professional guidance and in complete mental competency. Please don't come back without calling first. And please think carefully before involving lawyers, because I am not afraid of a courtroom and I have evidence that you would not enjoy having read aloud." I closed the door. I heard Diane's voice through the wood, sharp and frustrated. Nathan said something quieter. A car door. An engine. Gravel. I went to the kitchen and made tea with hands that trembled slightly. And I sat with it until they were steady again. I needed to leave, not permanently, but long enough to remember who Margaret Chen had been before she became Nathan's mother. Before she had shrunk her entire self down to fit into someone else's schedule. I booked a week at a small inn on the coast of Maine, a place Donald and I had always talked about visiting, and never had. I packed one bag, arranged for a neighbor to collect my mail, and drove north. The innkeepers were a couple in their late 60s, Jim and Carol, who had retired from careers in Boston and built the life they wanted at 62. On my first evening there, sitting in their dining room with chowder and warm bread, I told them the whole story. Carol listened with her chin in her hand. Jim refilled my water glass twice without being asked. When I finished, Carol said, "You didn't lose a son. You found out what you actually had. Those are different things." The week changed me. I met a retired nurse named Barbara who had not spoken to her daughter in 4 years and had made genuine peace with it. I met a widower named Gerald who organized hiking trips for seniors and invited me to join his group's spring trip to Acadia National Park before I even knew I was going to say yes. I said yes. Carol gave me the name of a support group back in Columbus for parents navigating estrangement from adult children. "People think it's shameful," she said, "but you'd be surprised how crowded that room is." I drove home on a Friday morning with the windows down, even though it was cold, because I needed the air. The certified letter from a law firm called Sloan and Hartley arrived the 3rd week of January. Our clients, Nathan and Diane Bennett, have retained our firm regarding concerns about the mental competency and potential undue influence involved in recent changes to the estate of Margaret Louise Chen. I want to note that my name is Margaret Louise Chen, not a confused woman who had been talked into something by a predatory financial advisor. I had been a school teacher for 41 years. I had filed my own taxes since I was 23. I had managed Donald's estate, paid off our mortgage, and raised a son largely on my own after Donald's first health scare when Nathan was 11. I called Richard. "They have nothing," he said, "but they are going to try to make this as uncomfortable as possible in hopes that you will settle." I said, "Let them try." Richard arranged a full psychological evaluation with Dr. James Whitmore, a clinical neuropsychologist at Ohio State. I spent 3 hours in his office answering questions, completing memory assessments, discussing my financial history and reasoning. He was thorough and unhurried. Afterward, he said, "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that your cognitive function is well above average for any age, let alone yours. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning is coherent, and your understanding of your own financial situation is detailed and accurate. If anyone is claiming otherwise, they are not doing so in good faith." I said, "Please put that in writing." He already had. The hearing was set for March. I spent 6 weeks preparing with Richard. I organized every text message Nathan had sent in the past 2 years, every financial transfer with its corresponding dates, every social media post Diane had made. She had posted Christmas photos with the caption, "Finally, a holiday with just the people who matter." I had not been tagged, obviously. I was not one of the people who mattered. Nathan's lawyers tried to build a picture of a grieving widow in cognitive decline who had been isolated from her family by a predatory attorney and a self-interested financial advisor. They called Richard's ethics into question. They suggested that Patricia had manipulated me for fees. They brought in a doctor I had never met who reviewed my records and offered vague concerns about grief-related decision-making. Then Richard presented 45 years of unblemished legal practice. Patricia presented a detailed record of every financial conversation we had ever had. Dr. Whitmore presented my evaluation results, and I took the stand. Nathan's attorney was polished and a little condescending in the way that some people are when they believe they are smarter than everyone in the room. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true you've been quite isolated since your husband's passing? I've been building new connections, yes? I said. And isn't it true that this attorney and financial advisor have become perhaps your primary social support? Richard and Patricia are professionals I trust. I also have friends from my 30 years at Westmore High School, a support group I attend weekly, and a hiking club I joined in February. I'm not certain I would describe myself as isolated, he pressed. And the decision to remove your son, your only child, from an inheritance of nearly $1 million, you don't consider that an emotional overreaction to one difficult evening? I considered it, I said, for several weeks. I reviewed every financial transaction between us for 3 years. I consulted an attorney and a financial advisor. I underwent a full psychological evaluation, and I arrived at the conclusion that my son had come to see me not as a mother but as a resource, and that I was not willing to leave the results of a lifetime of work to someone who had told me to leave my own grandchildren's Christmas dinner. The attorney paused. He was recalibrating. Do you love your son, Mrs. Chen? I looked at Nathan across the room. He was looking at his hands. I love the child I raised, I said. I'm still waiting to see whether that person is still there. Judge Patricia Holloway took less than an hour. The petitioners have offered no credible evidence of cognitive impairment, no evidence of undue influence, and no evidence of procedural irregularity in the execution of this will. Mrs. Chen is a competent adult, fully entitled to dispose of her estate as she sees fit. The petition is denied. This matter is closed. I walked out of that courthouse on a Tuesday morning in March into cold sunlight, and I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. I threw myself into living after that, which is a thing I had not truly done in 3 years. I joined Carol's book club recommendation and found a group that met at a wine bar on Thursday evenings. 8 women, between 60 and 78, who had all chosen, in various ways, to build lives that did not require anyone's permission. I went on the Acadia hiking trip with Gerald's group and discovered, somewhat to my own astonishment, that my legs were capable of considerably more than they had been asked to do lately. I started a garden in the backyard that Donald had always meant to plant and never had. I contacted the Columbus Public Library Foundation, one of the charities named in my will, and started volunteering in their adult literacy program on Monday afternoons. I sat across from a 60-year-old truck driver named Marcus, who was learning to read at a table full of books, and I thought about 41 years of teaching other people's children, and I thought, I am still useful. I am still here. The support group that Carol had recommended met on Tuesday evenings in a church basement on the north side of Columbus. I had expected sadness, and found instead a room full of people who were, most of them, further along in their grief than I was, and who had something I needed to see. They were fine, not performing fineness, but actually inhabiting lives that had room in them again. A retired electrician who had not spoken to his son in 6 years, and who had just returned from a fishing trip in Canada. A woman named Vera who had been cut off by both adult children and who fostered dogs on the weekends and laughed easily and often. A retired pastor named Howard who said, "The hardest thing I ever accepted was that I could not love my daughter into becoming a better person." I thought about that for a long time. I heard things about Nathan and Diane through mutual acquaintances, the way you hear things in a mid-sized city where people have long memories. The lawsuit had cost them more than they had anticipated. Nathan's firm, where he managed mid-level accounts, had clients who read local news. 3 of them quietly moved their business. The legal fees had drained the savings they had been trying to protect by going after my estate in the first place. Diane had started working full-time for the first time since Caleb was born. I did not feel satisfaction in this. I felt something closer to the sadness you feel when you watch someone make choices you cannot stop and then live inside the consequences. I had not done this to Nathan. Nathan had done this to Nathan. I had only stopped absorbing the impact. One afternoon in April, a woman I did not know knocked on my door. She introduced herself as Ellen, Diane's mother. I had met her twice at family gatherings. She was 64 and looked like she had not slept well in weeks. "I'm not here to take sides," she said immediately. I held the door open, and she came in, and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table where I had made decisions and cried and rebuilt myself over the past 4 months. "What Diane did was wrong," Ellen said. "What Nathan allowed was wrong. I told Diane that before Christmas, and I'm telling you now. I have grandchildren too, and I understand how much you must miss those babies." "I do," I said. "Caleb has been asking about you," she said carefully. Sophie drew a picture at school that she called Grandma Margaret's house, and the teacher asked Diane about it, and Diane threw it away. Something moved through my chest that I will not try to name. "When they're older," I said, "and if they want to find me, I won't be hard to locate. But I won't use children as leverage, and I won't allow them to be used that way either. If Diane is raising them to believe I abandoned them, that's a wound I can't heal from the outside. I can only make sure I'm here if they come looking." Ellen nodded. She finished her coffee. At the door, she paused and said, "For what it's worth, I think you're a remarkable woman, and I think you're going to be all right." "I think so too," I said. In June, I went to Scotland with 3 women from my book club. We drove through the Highlands in a rented car that was too small, argued cheerfully about directions, and toasted Donald at a pub in Edinburgh because he had always wanted to go and I was going for both of us. On our last evening, standing at the edge of a cliff above the North Sea with the wind so loud we could barely hear each other, my friend Louise leaned close and shouted something about how it was never too late. I shouted back that I was starting to believe her. On the second Thanksgiving since everything began, I hosted dinner. My dining room table, which had eaten 30 years of quiet family meals, held 14 people. Louise and her husband, Gerald from the hiking club, Vera from the support group, who brought 2 foster dogs and everyone loved them, Barbara from Maine, who had driven down for the weekend, my neighbor Dorothy and her husband, who had collected my mail and never once asked questions they knew I wasn't ready to answer, Ellen, Diane's mother, who came alone and sat between Dorothy and Gerald and laughed more than I had expected. We ate until we were ridiculous and talked until 10 o'clock. When they left, I stood in my kitchen and looked at the dishes and the half-empty wine glasses and the proof of people who had been here and been glad to be here, and I thought about a front porch in Westerville and a door being closed and a woman being sent away. I thought about what I had lost and what I had found in its place. I still think about Caleb with his telescope, the one that sat on their front step on Christmas Eve, and which I hope someone thought to bring inside. I still think about Sophie's fairy tales. I carry the hope of them quietly in the part of me that is still their grandmother, even when I am not allowed to be. If they come looking someday, I will be here. I will have a home that is full of people who choose to be in it. And 2 more chairs at my table, waiting. You are allowed to love someone completely and still refuse to accept the way they treat you. You are allowed to grieve a person who is still living. You are allowed to protect what you have built and to build something new with what remains, and to discover that the second chapter of your life has room in it for more than loss. I am Margaret Chen, retired teacher, gardener, hiker, traveler, friend. I spent 3 years being someone's grieving widow, and someone else's financial resource. I am done with both of those roles. What would you have done in my place? I'd really love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe. There are more stories coming, and you won't want to miss them.